Hello everyone, welcome to Psych, and today we're going to be talking about the importance of developing your auxiliary function, or your secondary function, the second function in your cognitive function stack. So when you come into typology and you're first learning about MBTI types, you'll often see people talk about the idea that we have 4 cognitive functions. And they'll present the first 2 functions as like these relatively balanced functions, like, oh, if you're an INTJ, you have dominant introverted intuition and you have secondary extroverted thinking, and these are going to be your kind of primary ways of interacting with the world, and you're going to be relatively good at them. But the way that Jung spoke about it is actually kind of against that idea, and we don't actually just start out great at our auxiliary function, and it's something that's critically important for us to develop. And that's what I want to talk about. Let's get into it. When we look at Carl Jung's interpretation of personality type in psychological types, we can remember that he originally only had 8 personality types listed, but he acknowledged the idea of there potentially being more. These 8 original types were each of the cognitive functions as a type, so this was the main determining factor of that type. The introverted intuitive types, for example, the introverted feeling types, the extroverted thinking types, and what made this type was what their lead function was. Now, what Jung talked about with each of these types was how these people develop their primary function as their primary kind of interface for interacting with the world. So if you were an introverted intuitive type, that was going to be the first way in which you interact with and understand the world. Now, the issue with this is that we don't see him talk about the auxiliary function until a little bit later, and then when he does talk about the auxiliary function, he talks about the importance of making sure you develop it to balance your dominant function. One thing to note before we continue is that in psychological types, Jung never strictly refers to the auxiliary function as being in the opposite attitude. So say, for example, as an INTJ, we often associate extroverted thinking as being the auxiliary function, when Jung refers to it as the auxiliary rational function, so auxiliary judging function. Now, Jung purists might say something like, well, introverted feeling could theoretically be the auxiliary function, but for the sake of MBTI typology and how we understand type and how we've used type, for the past few decades, I'm going to be talking about this through the lens of Briggs' interpretation of Jung. So essentially, that the auxiliary or secondary function is in the opposite attitude. Now, either way, the functions would be the same. So even if you were a Jung purist and you wanted to say that INTJs were NIFI, they would still have TE in their function stack, and it would still be relatively the same. Anyway, the point that we're going to make from this is that either way, it's important for you to develop this judging or rational function because it exists as a way to communicate the opposite needs of your dominant function. So when it comes to communicating the opposite needs of your dominant function, let's look at the INTJ again, for example. Why would we assume that extroverted thinking is the important function to develop versus, say, for example, introverted feeling? So if you're an introverted intuitive dominant type, you're a subjective perceiving type. You see a lot of perceptions in your own mind. You have images inside of you that you are seeing, and you kind of see meaning behind things. And it's going to be hard for you to explain these things to other people because it's a subjective interpretation. It's a subjective perception. I am perceiving these things. So why would it be wrong or difficult to kind of communicate this through introverted feeling instead of, say, for example, extroverted thinking? Well, introverted feeling is a rational function, that's for sure, but it's also a subjective rational function. So if you take your subjective perception and then put it through a subjective rational lens, you're going to have a very hard time attempting to rationalize and explain it to other people effectively. And this is one of the reasons, for example, that we don't often refer to types like NIFI or double introverted or double extroverted types in Jung's work, because it's important to have that balance. If you're an INTJ, if you have extroverted thinking, then you're going to have a way to communicate those subjective perceptions. This is what I'm seeing, and this is how the objective world can rationally see what I'm seeing. Back to the primary point of the video, though, which is that it's important to develop this function. So now we understand why I personally think that the auxiliary function's in the opposite attitude, and you can see maybe some of the logic there of why it's important to develop that. If you're an INTJ, you have those subjective perceptions, and you don't have the ability to objectively, rationally explain things that are internally inside you. How are you going to communicate your perceptions? And this is what Jung talked about, as I mentioned in my previous video, with the introverted intuitive dominance and the Cassandra complex. I have this vision of something that is to come, but no one will listen to me because I don't have the skills to properly explain it to the world around me. This is the curse of the subjective perceiving dominant types. Now, this applies to all of the different cognitive functions, though, and this is why it's critically important for you to develop your auxiliary function. Let's say, for example, we look at the ENTJ, the opposite of the INTJ, in terms of their top two functions. The ENTJ instead leads with an objective rational function, and what they're going to be doing is constantly noticing the objective rational factors around them and attempting to organize them or use them in any sort of way that's going to be practically and logically useful to them. So the issue that this type faces compared to the INTJ is that the ENTJ is not going to stop and allow themselves to have those inner perceptions, and instead is going to kind of bulldoze that extroverted thinking information onto other people. And it's important for them to stop and allow themselves to develop this introverted perceiving function to allow them to see the meaning behind things before they immediately jump into action and try to change the world around them without understanding the underlying meaning through their perceiving function. To kind of round out the examples I'm giving here, let's look at another type, the ISFP. The IPs are an introverted rational dominant type. So introverted feeling is introverted, subjective, and it's rational. It's a judging function. And they have secondary extroverted sensing, which is an objective irrational function. It's an extroverted perceiving function. Now, these types differ from, say, the IJs in that they lead with an introverted rational function. So it's important and rationally sound to them personally on a subjective level, and they often express this through irrational means. And what does that mean? So say, for example, the IJ has those subjective perceptions. They're going to have to learn to explain them to other people rationally. So here is the thing that I'm perceiving internally and how I can kind of communicate it to someone else in a rational manner. The IPs, on the other hand, say, look at this thing that I've been strongly resonating with and thinking about internally. How can I communicate this to other people without it coming off as too harsh? Or what's my way of authentically expressing this thing that I am feeling right now? Well, you'll often see that IPs, specifically IFPs, for example, will do things along the lines of expression through mediums such as art. This is why ISFPs are known for being artists. If we look at one of the archetypal ISFPs in history that changed the world, Michael Jackson, or some people think he might be like an ESFP, but it doesn't matter. I think he's an ISFP. You can see that his morals were kind of the thing that were presented in his music. A lot of the things that he sung, danced, and talked about in his life were kind of representative of the introverted rational judgments that he had. This is important to me, and I'm going to express it through an extroverted irrational process such as music or art that doesn't need to make rational sense for it to be important. Lastly, we have the EP personality types, and these types lead with extroverted perception, which is going to be objective and irrational, and then we have introverted or subjective rational functions as their auxiliary, so FI or TI. Now, these types are going to be the ones who are going to be usually relatively interactive with the outside world. They're adaptable. They're going to be the ones who are usually kind of thrill-seeking or novelty-seeking, idea-seeking. They want to kind of experience new things. And the issue that they're going to face if they don't develop their auxiliary function is that they're not going to know what's important to them, and they're going to have struggles kind of developing an inner sense of self about how to go about their life. So, for example, we see this a lot in the hero's journey with fictional characters who are fictional protagonists who are usually ESFPs, and we can think of someone like Finn from Adventure Time, or you could even think of some of the Lord of the Rings characters, and they set out on these grand journeys to do these things that they haven't really thought about. They're like, okay, I'm going to go do this thing because I want to, but I haven't really thought about it, and I haven't really thought about why it's important to me. And along the way through the journey, they develop this auxiliary introverted rational function, and then no longer is it just them on an adventure doing something fun that they're excited to be doing. It's now important to them. They have a reason to be doing it. And that's what it's going to look like when EPs develop that subjective rational function. So the main kind of takeaway from this video and what I'm really trying to say here is that types don't start out automatically proficient in their auxiliary function. It's not something that you're just kind of gifted, and a lot of people fail to recognize the importance of actually kind of working on this function. And I think above all the other functions, it might even be the most important. Because our repressed function is the one that's going to hold us back in our everyday lives, but it's also the one that Jung said, don't try to master. You can't become your repressed function. If you attempt to do this, you're going to fall into the trap of trying to be someone that you're not, and you're going to become neurotic, and life's just going to be relatively miserable. But what you can do is learn how to use your auxiliary function as a balanced way of interacting with the kind of other side of your psyche. So if you're an introverted type, you'll be able to comfortably interact with the extroverted side of your psyche. And if you're an extrovert, you'll be able to comfortably interact with the introverted side of your psyche. And allowing yourself to do this and have kind of a complete and holistic sense of mind is what's going to allow you to interact with yourself and other people in a more meaningful way that's not going to hold you back. And that's why, to me, it's really important for people to kind of recognize this idea that you need to develop this auxiliary function, and it's not just some natural gift given to you. If you enjoyed this video discussion, please let me know down in the comment section below. I think this was kind of an interesting topic and one that's frequently overlooked in the type community. Other than that, I would like to remind people that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asuraspsych.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Asura Psych. Have a good one.